Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 24th chapter in the book of Luke. We're going to span the range of the 13th through the 34th verse. This is a unique episode in the resurrection of the Messiah. We don't read of this anywhere else besides Luke, but we want to backtrack a bit. In the previous chapter, verse 24, 4 reads of the death. So we have the crucifixion in the previous chapter, and there are two thieves, the one who is declared saved that very day, the thief who made the deathbed confession that was accepted and granted, and then he expires, and then it's the 6th hour, so that means noon until 3, the whole earth, whole creation is subsumed in darkness. Sun is darkened and everything else, and he says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit, thus dying. Then in chapter 50 we read of the burial, so the trajectory is the death, the burial, and the resurrection, and that's what we witness in the the pre-antecedent chapter and passage within this chapter to the range we're going to be covering today. Read of a man named Joseph, a council member, the same council that had committed the Messiah to death, the death of the blasphemer. He raised an objection against it, and he went to Pilate and secured the body of this man, and thus fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah. He made his tomb with the wicked and his grave with the rich, because Joseph was a man of some influence on the Sanhedrin. And it is Sunday, or it is Saturday, by the time he's done burying, because that would the Jewish day really began at the Sabbath began at night down. So after resting one day after the Sabbath, he rested on the Sabbath. So I think it's still appropriate to maintain the seventh day worship. That's just my personal thing. You know, I'm not passionate enough to impose it on others, but if it were up to me, we'd worship on the seventh day. But at early dawn, and then who should behold him but what's familiar in the other accounts? It's they were perplexed, and it's they're not named here. I just realized that upon review, but it's just an angel who says that it's Mary and Magdalene and Joanna and the rest of them who told this to the apostles, and their witness is laughed at. It's rejected and ridiculed. Their words appeared to them to be nonsense, and they did not believe them. So even the apostles faltered at the initial report of the resurrection. But Peter arose and ran to the tomb, and stooped down. He saw the linen wrappings lying by themselves, and went away home, marveling at what took place. So Peter is an action-oriented disciple. He's often the spokesperson, and he's the first to move and first to speak he's the leader of the 12. And he goes and investigates the claim, and then he is astonished because he knows that their report is true. And it's not until he actually reveals himself first to two disciples, if we approach this in the narrative. These are Cleophas, one of them is named, the other is not unanimous. Then he reveals himself to the 12 beyond the range we're going to be covering today. But the 13th verse marks the beginning of the lesson itself. And see, two of them were going that same way to a village called Emmaus, which was 60 stadios from Jerusalem. So the them is the same as in verse 11. It is disciples in the broad term, not the what would eventually came to be known through Luke's writing of Acts as the apostles. The disciples are the 12, but it's also a more broad thing. So two of these disciples, of whom nothing else is written, and one of them we don't even know his name, were going the same way that Peter was from the tomb to the echo. And Emmaus was about 7.5 miles away from Jerusalem. That's 60 stadios, so that still would have been a day's journey, or if not several. And they were talking to each other of all this which had taken place. So it's only natural to have witnessed they came from Jerusalem, where the entire city was in a furor and an uproar, and they killed the Messiah, and upon that killing, the city and the surrounding area was completely enmeshed in blackness and darkness. But having been there, they would have witnessed all that had took place, and their faith, they had been followers of the Messiah, yet they do not believe, their faith in him as the Messiah is shaken. They refer to him as a prophet, as we read. And it came to be that as they were talking and reasoning, that Yahshua himself drew near and went with them. So this is known to us. We have the gift of hindsight and foresight that these two anonymous disciples do not, but just suddenly, almost out of the blue, not magically, but miraculously, the resurrected Savior appears. He is as a ghost. He can come and go as he please. He vanishes. He does have vanishing qualities and abilities. But he makes himself present and manifest with them while they are walking en route to Jerusalem, to Emmaus, some 7.5 miles away. But their eyes were restrained, so they did not know him. So no, they had no idea who he was. They just took him as an anonymous stranger, and they were walking by him, but their eyes were elsewhere. They couldn't gaze upon the man himself and recognize his face, because they would have instantly recognized him, being his disciples. And he said to them, "What are these words that you are exchanging with each other as you are walking? And you are sad." So he has the vantage point of a concerned outsider. He notes that they are sad. So what are they talking about that is making them so sad? So he wants to know what their conversation is. And we don't read. We read that they were talking to each other of all that which took place in the 14th verse. So what they were talking about was obviously making themselves sad, and sad enough for the stranger to sort of artfully, subtly poke his way in and turn those frowns upside down. And the one whose name was Cleophas answered and said to him, "Are you the lone visitor in Jerusalem who does not know what took place in these days?" So Cleophas is the one of the two who we know by name, and he's the spokesman of the two. And what he asks him is that, how could you miss what we had just beheld? Were you in Jerusalem, as all Jews were supposed to be for the 3 holidays a year, as prescribed in Deuteronomy 16:16? So how could you not know? Why do you not know what's the matter? It should be obvious, the death of a great prophet, they say. And he said to them, "What?" And they said to him, "Concerning Yahshua of Nazareth, who was a prophet mighty in deed and word before Elohim and all the people." So unbeknownst to them, they are referring the man to himself. It is about him that they are talking about. They are in ignorance. They don't even know that he is literally right by them. He's looking at them and speaking to them in the face. And they followed him as the Messiah, but their hopes were disappointed and seemingly defeated when he expired on the cross, because the Jewish conception of the Messiah could not envision a Messiah who was tortured and killed by his own people. But he did not deny that he was a prophet, but the Messiah he had looked for, perhaps he had pointed to the one who would come after them. So as far as they know, their faith was shattered in ruins, because they held to the Jewish conception of a Messiah as a national liberator, but he came to liberate or defeat an enemy more powerful and sinister than Rome itself, that is Satan, sin, and death. And he offers us a way out, whether Jew or Gentile. And how the chief priest and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and impaled them. So the chief priest and the synagogue authorities, they could not execute Yahshua on their own volition. And the crime that they charged him with was blasphemy. They were Jews, and as such invoked the death penalty according to Leviticus 24:16. So they used that against him. But the Romans, they had to seek their permission to issue capital punishment, to kill one of their own. They had to have Roman authorization and approval, and they consented. They beleaguered Pontius Pilate to death. He offered them a way out from killing this man no less than 3 times. and yet they neglected the message. But we, however, so they crucified him as he had predicted. So these disciples weren't part of the disciples. They weren't part of the 12. They weren't the intimate ones to whom he had revealed that they were walking to his death in Jerusalem. They were en route to Jerusalem, and he would not make it home in the same piece. He would make it home to heaven after the ascension, which is alluded to after the range we'll be covering today. We, however, were expecting that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. But besides all this, today is the third day since this took place. So they were hoping, they had been led to believe that he was the Messiah, that he was more than a mere prophet, that he was the liberator and the redeemer of Israel. Yet he stood hung on a cross, expired in the grave for 3 days, and then the third day is when it all must take place. Earlier in Luke's account, I think it's in the 11th chapter, they ask, show us a sign, and he says, an evil and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign. No sign shall ye see, but the sign of the prophet Jonah. And what that is that Jonah, the Old Testament prophet, who was swallowed when the storm came to his seaboat, his ship in the sea, he was thrown overboard to quiet the storm, swallowed whole by a fish in the Old Testament, and he spent 3 days in the belly. He gave his best prayer in his worst place, then he was spat out. And so the 3 days that he spent in the belly of the whale was a physically representative, symbolically allusion of the resurrection to come. So Jonah didn't even know what the sign of Jonah was, but that is what the master answered the evil and adulterous generation. I am the sign. My death and burial and resurrection will be the sign which will confirm that I am who I say I am. But certain women of ours who arrived at the tomb early also astonished us. When they did not find his body, they came in saying that he had also seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. So certain women of ours, they would have belonged to the community of the disciples, and there were females in the early Christian church, such as Martha and Mary and Joanna, who we read of earlier. But these certain women, they're not specified exactly who they are. We know that they were. We don't know who they were, but they arrived at the tomb early also. So this was them. They had relayed the rumor or the report of the resurrection because they did not find his body, and the Jews took great caution and measures to ensure that his body would remain in the tomb. After 3 days, they put a giant block in a stone carrying the Roman insignia, making it illegal to break into, and they posted a guard, but an angel came in the night, and they didn't even have a chance of containing him in the tomb because he was alive. And some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it, as also the woman had said, but they did not see him. So they did not see him, so they did not believe that he had, in fact, risen from his grave and walked among the earth and life. So their faith, they are walking by sight. They need a visible manifestation and intervention and display of the Savior in order to have their faith in the resurrection intact. They may or may not have received the promise, but for any case, their faith and their hope are dashed. Their faith is diminished and their hopes are dashed, so they think, but they're in for a surprise. And he said to them, O thoughtless ones, the slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. So he says they are without excuse. As Jews, they had access to the Old Testament prophets, and they should have known and understood what they had written about the one who must suffer, and the suffering servant, and literally the prophet. And he takes them through the scriptures, so we're going to take it through Genesis all the way till Malachi in our description in that. Was it not necessary for the Messiah to suffer these and to enter into his esteem? So in order to enter into his esteem, this is a rhetorical question. The obvious answer is yes, it is it is necessary for him to have suffered in them, and because before the crown had to come the cross, before the splendor had to come the suffering, and if it was that way with him, we who call his disciples have no right or reason to expect it not to be that way with us. So it was completely necessary for the plan of salvation that he endure the bitter agony of the passion and rise on the third day, esteemed and eternally exalted. And beginning at Moses and the prophets, he was explaining to them in the scriptures, all the scriptures that concerning himself. So the trick to reading the Old Testament as New Testament Christians is to look for the Son on every page. I refrain from encouraging you from finding him on the Son every place, because ultimately I feel that invites an excessively or inordinately speculative approach. But look for him. He is there. He is there in Genesis 1:26. Let us go down and make a man in our image. And then he is there as the Redeemer, the proto-evangelism, the first proclamation of the Redeemer to come, we read of in Genesis 3:15. He will crush the serpent on the head, but the serpent will wound him greatly. So Satan wounded Yahshua on the cross, and he thought the victory was his that day, but he was in for the rude awakening that he was defeated for all time and for all eternity on the cross. And then there's the example of Isaac in Genesis 22, the beloved only son, the covenant son, the son of promise, who Abraham, as a matter of a test in faith, was asked to sacrifice him on a mountain. He went through all the motions. He didn't ask questions. He heard the command and he did it. He didn't question. And then when Isaac, his son, is asking him, where is the ram? He says, Yahweh will provide. And sure enough, he does. He has an angel. When he has the knife in hand, an angel intervenes and slices a ram there. But the willingness to sacrifice his own son is reflective of the father's willingness to do what he did to his own son. And then in Exodus, he's the Passover lamb, the lamb of Elohim, John 1:9-20. He's in the everything in the Levitical sacrifices, the atonements, lowercase a, leads to the atonement, capital A. And, prophets from the Psalms, Psalm 22, unmistakably allude to him. So does Isaiah 53 and the prophets, so writings of the prophets that can be none other than him. And Isaiah has much to say. He is the fifth gospel on account of the frequency of his references to the Redeemer. So we do have an accurate encapsulation of the New Testament which awaits us. We can dig that out from the Old Testament in order to, but we're privileged to have the advantage of hindsight that the ancient Jews who had only the Old Testament lacked. And they approached the village where they were going, and he seemed to be going on. So they had a destination. This village is perhaps Emmaus. They were going, but he kept going. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, for it is toward evening, and the day has declined." And he went in to stay with them. So he accommodated their request. It was getting dark. It was getting late. He didn't have a place to go. So we can imagine that the Messiah was walking forward, and he's not bound by the limits of space and time in resurrected form. Even before resurrected form, it could be argued. But in any case, he does accept their offer of hospitality. Even though they are faithless, they are charitable enough to extend the Christian hospitality of virtue of hospitality. So he accepts their invitation. And it came to be when he sat at the table with them, having taken the bread, he blessed, and having broken, he was giving it to them. So with the breaking and the blessing of the blood, this was not a Lord's Supper. This was not a Last Supper memorial or ceremony or ordinance. It was just an ordinary meal. But he did bless the bread, and at that moment in time, they knew instantly what they denied earlier or struggled to believe or didn't even think to imagine, that he was alive and resurrected. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. So as soon as they knew that he was gone, and they missed in some sense, they missed their moment with with God, but a moment in his presence is never missed. So they were the wiser for his instant departure, but they realize that he works in our life even when we don't notice him. So oftentimes he will work in our lives through others, and that is him working through others in us. And we are similarly without excuse, but we are equally liable and equally culpable. And they said to each other, "Was not our heart burning within us as he was speaking to us on the way, and as he was opening the scriptures to us?" So they had a premonition of that this man was who he said he was when he was expounding on the scriptures on the roadside, but they still invited him as an ordinary guest. But he asked the right question. So every so often, every one of us has benefited from a good teacher who asked the right question, because the right question will expose our ignorance or anything else that is preventing us from unlocking that which we need to know. So the good teacher asked the right questions, and there are two questions he asked in this. Was it necessary for the Messiah to suffer this and to enter into his esteem? And that's one of the questions, just an example. But he is the best teacher, and he does intervene in our lives when we least expect it. When we are not looking for him, he nevertheless manifests and makes himself known, alive, and present. And we can hear his voice because the word is more extensive than the Bible alone, but the word is connected to, it reveals, it points to the word, the human embodiment, the personification of the word, the logos of John 1:1. And rising up that same hour, they returned to Jerusalem and found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together. So they gather their things. They go from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and they go right back 7.5 miles that way. As soon as they realize who he is, or not long then after, they are right back to Jerusalem, 7.5 miles the other way, and they immediately summon themselves to the apostles, the 11. Judas is dead at this point. Paul has yet to be, and Matthias has yet to be voted on. And those who are with them gathering together. So this was more than the 11. This was the disciples, capital D, and the disciples, lowercase d, saying, "The Master was truly raised and has appeared to Simon." So Simon is Simon Peter. He is the original. So this might actually mark the next section of the book, but that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.